Hi, my name's Associate Professor Renee Turner and I'm the NRF Director of Neurosurgical Research here at the University of Adelaide. In this role as the Director of Neurosurgical Research, it is my job to foster, create and nurture neurosurgical research here at the University. So day to day, I get to come to work, think up research projects, think of problems to solve and do this with a fantastic team of staff and students. It's a fun place to be and we feel very fortunate that we are at this interface between preclinical work and forging discoveries with the ultimate goal of improving the lives of patients with stroke and other brain conditions.
So can you tell us which lab you work at, Renee?
So I head the Translational Neuropathology Laboratory. I know that's a bit of a mouthful, but essentially that means that we are studying a number of neuropathological conditions, including stroke, but also others like traumatic brain injury. And our goal is to translate what we find in the lab at the bench to the bedside in the clinic. So hence the translational lab aspect. Now, just a little note on that. It can be perhaps a little bit difficult to understand what goes on in a lab and why that doesn't quickly end up in the clinic. But what we do in the lab a lot of the time is incrementally add knowledge to a particular disease pathway or injury mechanism. So it can take many projects joined together, many students' work to contribute to that end goal. So to give you an example, during my PhD I started working on a novel drug to treat brain swelling following stroke. Almost 20 years later, we're just in the clinic doing some clinical trials. So it can be a long road, but it's an essential one. So it's important we don't skip any steps. We really rigorously screen and develop these novel therapies in the preclinical setting at the bench, so that when we get to the bedside, we're much more likely to have a good outcome. We only want to proceed those things to the clinic and clinical trials that we think are really going to work to improve patient outcomes.
So can you tell us a little bit about yourself? So what's your background and what drew you to research initially?
I guess growing up I never saw myself being a scientist, never considered it. I thought about things like medicine, psychology, even a forensic pathologist. But it was really only when I got to university and really just followed my nose in terms of what interested me. I took molecular biology, immunology, and it was really third year when I took pathology. I think that was a crucial step for me. I just loved learning about disease, in particular diseases of the brain. And so following that year, I decided to do an honours degree where I looked at traumatic brain injury. And it was really that year where I decided, I love this, I want to be a researcher. And after that, I pursued a PhD, and that's where my interest in stroke really took off. And since that time, for nearly 2 decades now, I've been a stroke researcher. And looking not only at improving acute outcomes, but also chronic outcomes following stroke. So really the overarching goal of my lab is to identify, screen and develop new treatments to not only improve short-term survival, but also long-term neurological improvement following stroke. Because we know it's not only just the devastating early mortality, but also the long-term disability and dementia, which can really impact people's quality of life. So that's the overarching goal of my research team.
So can you tell us a little bit about some of the current research projects that are happening?
Absolutely, and I don't want to scoop my students, but I'll give you a little snippet of what we're doing at the moment. We've got a couple of key projects. One is funded by the Medical Research Future Fund, and this is the SPRINTS project. In this project, we're looking at treating a complication of stroke called reperfusion injury. We know in stroke, when we have a blockage, the goal is to get the blood flow back as soon as possible so we can save as much brain as we can and therefore function for the patient. But sometimes bringing the blood flow back can actually make the injury worse. So it can lead to bleeding complications, brain swelling, and inflammation of the brain. So in the SPRINTS project, what we're doing is we're taking a drug that is previously used elsewhere in the clinic for chemotherapy-induced nausea and vomiting, and we're repurposing it for a different indication. So treating reperfusion injury following stroke. So with this, we hope to identify whether this novel agent can reduce inflammation, reduce brain swelling, and reduce bleeding complications following the stroke, all with the end goal of improving outcome. And we're doing this in a whole host of preclinical models of stroke, but also we're doing a patient feasibility study to see if this new treatment is actually feasible to use in the clinic. Another project that we're working on is looking at long-term outcomes following stroke. We know now that brain tissue loss doesn't only occur in the days following stroke, but can actually continue and be seen months or even years following the stroke event. It is this delayed loss of brain tissue, termed secondary neurodegeneration, which is leading to a decline in cognitive outcomes and things such as dementia. Both of these can really impede quality of life for stroke survivors. So here in the lab, we're looking at what factors are involved in driving this delayed loss of brain tissue to see when does it happen and what are the key players so we can potentially intervene with a novel treatment. Another project we're looking at in the lab is whether we can harness the brain's own protective mechanisms to treat stroke. You may have heard of a protein called amyloid, and yes, the bad form of this protein is associated with Alzheimer's disease. The good form of this protein is actually neuroprotective, and that means we can use it to protect the brain. So in preclinical models of stroke, we've shown that when we give this good form of the APP protein, it improves outcomes. And so that's what we're going to look at in more detail in different models of preclinical stroke. If we give this good form of APP, does it reduce the inflammation in the brain? Does it improve outcomes? And this is a particularly exciting project because it's something that is produced naturally within the brain. And if we can harness this, it provides a really exciting opportunity to treat stroke. So what we're also looking at in the lab is what the influence of age at stroke has on outcome. Now we know stroke is predominantly a condition which affects people over the age of 65, but you might be interested to know that 1 in 5 strokes actually happen in people under the age of 55, in the prime of their lives, sometimes even younger. So one of our projects is looking at different age of stroke, different time of age of stroke, and what influence this has on outcome. Do you have poorer outcomes if you're older at your time of stroke or not? These are the types of questions we're asking with the hopes of identifying different injury mechanisms and pathways which are activated to potentially guide more tailored treatment options following stroke.
Thanks, Renee, that sounds great. So what would you say to someone who might be interested in pursuing a career in research?
For anyone interested in pursuing a career in medical science, I would say there are a couple of key things. Number one is just have a passion for what you do. This can be a tough gig sometimes, but it's very rewarding. So I think if you have that drive and that passion for what you do, that keeps you going through the tough times. I think the second thing is having some knowledge behind you. So a lot of students that come into the lab come from a biomedical or a health science background, or perhaps have done some clinical training as well. So having some knowledge of the body or the brain in particular is really useful. And number three, I would just say be willing to get in and work as a team. This is really a team effort. We have a lot of fun doing it, but none of this happens in isolation. So it is true teamwork that makes these kinds of research projects happen, and many, many years of work goes on to actually get to a meaningful outcome for the clinic.
And outside of research, what do you like to do in your spare time?
Well, I'm a mum of 2 kids, so I don't have a lot of spare time, but I'm an avid cricket fan, so during the summer months you'll find me down at Adelaide Oval taking in all 5 days of the Test match. I'm also a bit of a reality TV tragic, so I don't mind taking in a few episodes of The Bachelor, and I love baking, so whenever it's anyone's birthday or special event in the family, I'll be baking them a special birthday cake and some sweet treats.
Mine's 3rd of November, just for a heads up. No, thank you for being here today, we really appreciate it.
So Team Stroke here at the University of Adelaide, we've got a fantastic team of students and staff, so honours students, PhD students and research staff, all together working for the end goal of improving outcome for stroke patients. As you can see, we've got a whole host of projects going on, and this is made possible by the generous support of the NRF.